You stock this shelf with films of imagination. They take you to another dimension. A dimension of sound. A dimension of sight. A dimension of mind. You're moving into a land of both style and substance, where movies are celebrated, not incinerated. You've just crossed over into the DVD Shelf Movie Reviews. Portrait of an online movie reviewer whose sole purpose in his endeavor is to spread his passion for film like a virus. But passion has been known to lead to obsession, and in this case, obsession has arrived in the form of a disgustingly large collection of Blu-rays and DVDs. Now this begs the question, where does one draw the line between a love of the cinema and collecting DVDs for the mere thrill of consumption? David Rose is sure to find out the answer because he's about to pay matinee price for a ticket that'll grant him access to a front row, center seat in the Twilight Zone.
My turn yet?
You're a hack, you know that?
Welcome everyone to the DVD Shelf Movie Reviews. I'm your host David Rose, and today, as you can probably guess, we'll be traveling to the fifth dimension to explore the history behind one of the most significant television shows of all time, The Twilight Zone. We'll also get caught up on the background of the show's iconic creator, Rod Serling, and learn what inspired him to create such a groundbreaking TV series. Of course, this will all lead up to my review of 1983's Twilight Zone the movie, a blend of fantasy and horror split into 4 separate tales from 4 different directors, meant to pay tribute to Serling's original vision. I'll cover each segment of the film individually and touch on the horrific and fatal on-set accident that ended up shaping this movie's controversial reputation. I'll give the film and its Blu-ray my final recommendation, and finally, I'll wrap up the show by delving a bit into the legacy of this landmark TV series. So sit back and strap in, because you're about to enter an area in which we call the Twilight Zone. Directed by John Landis, Steven Spielberg, Joe Dante, and George Miller, and starring Dan Aykroyd, Albert Brooks, Scatman Crothers, John Lithgow, Vic Morrow, and Kathleen Quinlan. Its original theatrical run began on June 24, 1983, and the DVD and Blu-ray were both released on October 9, 2007. By the early 1980s, powerhouse filmmaker Steven Spielberg was on top of the Hollywood game by directing such monster hits like Jaws, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and Raiders of the Lost Ark, and it was around this time that he was approached by Warner Brothers studio executives, who had recently dusted off an old abandoned film project first pitched sometime during the 1960s by pioneering television writer Rod Serling. Serling had been shopping around the idea of developing a feature-length version of his massively popular and highly influential science fiction anthology TV series, The Twilight Zone, which had a 5-year run on CBS from 1959 to 1964. But when Serling found it difficult to get TV and film projects off the ground following the show's cancellation, he came up with the idea of adapting it into a feature-length film. Unfortunately, Serling's sudden death in 1975 halted any further negotiations for a Twilight Zone movie. As the years passed and reruns of The Twilight Zone continued to generate a wider audience, Warner Brothers revived the idea of a feature film and swiftly bought the rights from Serling's widow. But the project didn't get fast-tracked until Steven Spielberg was offered to produce and possibly direct it. Being a huge fan of the original TV series since his youth, Spielberg quickly jumped at the opportunity, looking at it as the perfect way to bridge a generation gap between the baby boomers who grew up watching The Twilight Zone and their kids who were probably not as familiar with it yet. The Twilight Zone was conceived out of Rod Serling's own frustrations with the heavy censoring of television content by corporate sponsors. Serling would fully admit that his time serving in the U.S. Army during World War II had a big hand in shaping the kind of person he'd become, an idealist, always walking around with a chip on his shoulder. Anyone familiar with his works can clearly tell that his nightmarish wartime experiences were heavily influential on his writing, and Serling had a lot to say as he gravitated towards the infant medium of television. Amidst interning and working for various television and radio stations in New York and Ohio, he got the most enjoyment out of writing fictional dramas, and found it a good way to get things that bothered him off his chest by using storytelling as a vehicle for saying what he wanted to say. He knew that the only way he could possibly make that a full-time job was to work in broadcasting to gain job experience, which led him to writing for the WLW radio station in Cincinnati, Ohio. After hating the work he was given, he soon transferred to Cincinnati's WKRC television station and became a staff writer, a somewhat dreamless occupation as he'd put it. It wasn't long before Serling eventually moved his wife and family to New York in 1954, where he finally began finding success doing what he loved best: dramatic writing for television. By 1958, Serling had won 3 Emmy Awards for his work on screenplays that were sold to 2 popular dramatic anthology TV shows, Kraft Television Theater on NBC and Playhouse 90 on CBS. This was back in the early days of television, where corporate-sponsored live performances were broadcast in an anthology format, meaning that every episode had a different and unconnected set of characters, setting, and story. Much to the dismay of writers like Rod Serling, what was acceptable to be shown on TV was greatly dictated by corporate sponsors, who strictly wanted programming that best fit the image of the products they were pushing.
You can understand the position of the sponsor, can't you?
In many ways, I suppose I can. He's there to push a product.
He has a considerable stake, thus, in what goes on the air.
Most assuredly. And in those cases where there is a problem of public taste, in which there is a concern for eliciting negative response from a large mass of people, I can understand why the guys are frightened.
Sure.
I don't understand, Mike, for example, other evidences and instances of intrusion by sponsors. For example, on Playhouse 90, not a year ago, a lovely show called Judgment at Nuremberg. In it, as you recall, mention was made of gas chambers.
Yeah.
And the line was deleted, cut off the soundtrack. And it mattered little to these guys that the gas involved in concentration camps was cyanide, which bore no resemblance, physical or otherwise, to the gas used in stoves. They cut the line.
Because the sponsor was...
He did not want that awful association made between what was the horror and the misery of Nazi Germany with the nice chrome, wonderfully antiseptically clean, beautiful kitchen appliances that they were selling. Now this is an example of sponsor interference which is so beyond logic and which is so beyond taste. This I rebel against.
Serling, never one to keep his frustrations to himself, spent these days fighting tooth and nail to make sure that what he wrote could remain as intact as possible for final broadcast. That being said, Serling typically wrote about challenging social injustices or confronting his own personal demons, the kind of stuff that doesn't sell Colgate toothpaste or Kraft cheese.
I don't want to have to battle sponsors and agencies. I don't want to have to push for something that I want and have to settle for second best. I don't want to have to compromise all the time, which in essence is what the television writer does if he wants to put on controversial themes.
Well, then why do you stay in television?
I stay in television because I think it's very possible to perform a function of providing adult, meaningful, exciting, challenging drama without dealing in controversy necessarily. This, of course, Mike, is not the best of all possible worlds. I am not suggesting that this is at the absolute millennium. I think it's criminal that we're not permitted to make dramatic note of social evils as they exist, of controversial themes as they are inherent in our society. I think it's ridiculous that drama, which by its very nature should make a comment on those things that affect our daily lives, is in the position, at least in terms of television drama, of not being able to take this stand.
Always outspoken about his criticisms against corporate censorship, Serling set out to create and produce his own dramatic TV series, where his creative freedoms couldn't be stripped away by sponsors. CBS picked up Serling's new show, which made its history-making debut on October 2nd, 1959.
You've got a new series coming up called The Twilight Zone. You are writing as well as acting executive producer on this one. Who controls the final product? You or the sponsor?
We have what I think, at least theoretically anyway, because it hasn't really been put into practice yet, a good working relationship, where in questions of taste, in questions of the art form itself, in questions of drama, I'm the judge. Well, these are very adult, I think high quality, half-hour, extremely polished films. But because they deal in the areas of fantasy and imagination and science fiction and all of those things, there's no opportunity to cop a plea or chop an axe or anything.
Your next stop, the Twilight Zone.
Under the guise of certain fantastical concepts like time travel, extraterrestrial contact, ghosts, the afterlife, and so on, Rod Serling and his band of talented writers were able to get away with tackling taboo subjects like war, prejudice, racism, and other topics that would straddle the line between what was and what wasn't normally acceptable on TV at that time. Underlying themes of The Twilight Zone covered just about anything ranging from paranoia to spirituality, from the fears of isolation to the questioning of one's own existence, topics as broad as current social issues or as intimate as the fragility of one's own sanity. They were stories of the human condition, life, death, and everything in between. Some of the most famous episodes do have a certain creepy or horrific atmosphere to them, however, some were purely dramatic pieces, or even comical on occasion. But what remained consistent throughout virtually all of the 156 episodes were the surrealistic plot twists that typically drove home the moral of the story. In most cases, the guilty would get what was coming to them, and the innocent would get their reward, usually by some strange twist of ironic fate. The Twilight Zone had a pretty substantial hand at turning science fiction into a much more important and widely accepted form of storytelling. Had Rod Serling created just a run-of-the-mill TV drama, it's highly likely that his morals and messages wouldn't have become so memorable as they did through the Twilight Zone's countless number of strange plot devices and unforgettable images. After having written over 90 of the 156 episodes, Serling was finding it difficult to stay fresh and creative, so he wasn't necessarily heartbroken when The Twilight Zone was canceled in 1964. By now, he had won 6 Emmy Awards and was the recipient of the first ever George Foster Peabody Award given to a television writer. But still, it was a challenge for him to find new TV and film projects that really clicked, aside from him famously receiving a co-writing credit on the screenplay for the original Planet of the Apes. Not expecting The Twilight Zone to have much of a life after its cancellation, Serling sold off the syndication rights, a move he would later regret since to this day the show continues to air in reruns. But by retaining the rights to create a Twilight Zone feature film, he came up with an idea inspired by the 1945 British anthology horror movie Dead of Night, which told multiple stories within its feature-length runtime. Serling described his Twilight Zone movie concept as a trilogy of separate short stories hosted by him that would be filmed in black and white to retain the feel of the original series and minimize the budget. Serling had several ideas in mind for stories that could be included in the film's different segments, but when a development deal never came into fruition, he took some of those stories and went on to inject them into a new television series. Serling returned to his claim to fame in 1969 as the host of another anthology series, Night Gallery, on NBC, which was a much darker show, more steeped in horror and the supernatural than the original Twilight Zone. Walking through a darkened art gallery, Serling presented various paintings that would kick off each segment, but unlike the Twilight Zone, typical Night Gallery episodes would feature multiple stories. Night Gallery was canceled in 1973, and once again Serling wasn't all that upset because by this point he was fed up with constant criticism and his stifled creative input on the show. In 1975, Rod Serling's years of endless hard work, constant stress, and heavy chain smoking seemingly took their toll when he died of a sudden heart attack at the relatively young age of 50 years old. Despite the notoriety the Twilight Zone brought to Serling, being widely regarded as a historically significant writer and a highly influential cultural figure didn't really occur until after his death, which seems to happen to those who were light years ahead of their time. And it's a shame that he never got to see the resurgence in the Twilight Zone's popularity by the early 80s. Even director Steven Spielberg isn't immune to Rod Serling's influence, but his ties to Serling are a bit closer than you might expect. In fact, one of Spielberg's first ever directing jobs was for a segment featured in the 1969 pilot episode of Night Gallery, and he later returned to direct another segment in 1971. Also in '71, Spielberg directed the Twilight Zone-esque made-for-TV movie Duel, a spine-tingling tale about a salesman being stalked by an evil and mysterious driver of a tanker truck. Trust me, it's a lot better than it sounds. Premiering on ABC in the fall of 1971, the suspense thriller starred veteran TV actor Dennis Weaver, who was also featured in a classic Season 2 episode of The Twilight Zone a decade earlier. Now, Duel probably gives off a certain Twilight Zone aura because it was written by frequent Twilight Zone scribe and acclaimed science fiction novelist Richard Matheson.
I was intimately familiar with the work of Richard Matheson because I was a complete, obsessive, compulsive Twilight Zone follower. And so I knew of his work on the Twilight Zone and some of the really great episodes of that.
Duel went on to become so well received that it was eventually given a theatrical release, and thus Steven Spielberg's film career was kicked into overdrive. When Warner Brothers handed the Twilight Zone movie project to Spielberg, he thought it would be a great way to collaborate with his friend and fellow director, John Landis, who by now had his own string of hit films like Animal House, The Blues Brothers, and An American Werewolf in London. Spielberg and Landis agreed to produce The Twilight Zone together while directing their own segments in what would eventually become a 4-part anthology. Landis wrote a prologue and an original segment, not directly based on any episodes of the TV series. For the rest of the film, Spielberg brought on screenwriter Richard Matheson, whom he had previously worked with on Duel, and was probably the one surviving former Twilight Zone writer who was the most familiar with Serling's creation outside of Serling himself. Not including the original idea written by John Landis, Matheson wrote the remaining segments, which were direct remakes of classic Twilight Zone episodes. Landis's turn in the director's chair came first, and initially, the production came together rather gracefully. But it wasn't too long after cameras began rolling in the summer of 1982 that the members of the film crew found themselves thrust into the darkest and deadliest corner of the Twilight Zone. A lonely automobile winds its way down an eerily dark and empty road. The driver, played by Albert Brooks, and his passenger, played by Dan Aykroyd, engage in a guessing game where one person hums a classic TV theme song and the other has to guess it, which sparks a nostalgic conversation about their favorite episodes of the classic Twilight Zone TV series.
God, remember the Twilight Zone with Burgess Meredith? Remember, he loved to read, and there was a nuclear war, and he had no friends anyway, and he was down in the basement of the library. Yes, he was the last man. He broke his glasses. Yeah. This thing freaked me out. When I was 7 years old, I bought another pair of glasses just in case that would happen.
Oh, those shows, they were so good. They were so scary.
Yeah. Oh, great.
They were great. Remember the one where the guy had the stopwatch? Somebody in a bar gave him a stopwatch, and he was this real obnoxious guy, and he took the stopwatch, and he hit it, and everybody else in time froze but him.
That's an Outer Limits.
No, that was a zone.
That's an Outer Limits.
That was a zone.
For the record, it's a zone. Anyway, Aykroyd then famously asks Brooks,
You want to see something really scary?
And when Brooks appears to be up to the challenge, Aykroyd suddenly transforms into a demonic creature and proceeds to brutally attack him. John Landis's prologue is certainly an interesting way to start things off. Apparently most of the dialogue was improvised by Dan Aykroyd and Albert Brooks, and as a result, their banter comes off as genuine and natural. The way the original Twilight Zone series is admired during the conversation, I think firmly establishes that the film is a self-aware love letter to Rod Serling's original series, not to mention the funny little nod to the confusion between the Twilight Zone and the similar 60s anthology series, The Outer Limits. Now, the prologue doesn't really seem to feel much like The Twilight Zone, unless you consider Aykroyd's transformation as a twist ending. It's a surprise for sure, but that's really all there is to it. Still, it's not like the prologue is supposed to be an actual story or anything, but I think its biggest strength is how it sets up the playfully dark atmosphere of the movie that follows. Not only that, but you've got to appreciate the humorous breaking of the movie's fourth wall by actually going as far as mentioning the Twilight Zone TV series itself. And you gotta remember that this movie was made years before filmmakers like Quentin Tarantino and Kevin Smith made it commonplace for on-screen characters to analyze pop culture.
And on that note, we cue the music.
You unlock this door with a key of imagination. Beyond it is another dimension.
The opening monologue and introductions to each segment were narrated by veteran TV and film actor Burgess Meredith, due to Rod Serling being unavailable. Nonetheless, Meredith fits right into this universe after having been featured in 4 episodes of the original Twilight Zone, and never failed to turn in a stellar performance.
You just crossed over into the Twilight Zone.
Meredith narrates us into the first segment entitled Time Out, the story of a loudmouthed bigot named Bill Connor who goes on a public racist tirade in a bar after just losing out on a big promotion to a Jewish coworker. After embarrassing his drinking buddies, he storms out of the bar and into the Twilight Zone. Suddenly, Bill finds himself victimized in a trio of racially driven nightmares. Chased down by Nazis as a Jewish man, nearly lynched by 1950s-era Ku Klux Klansmen as a black man, and almost blown to pieces as a member of the Viet Cong by US soldiers in the Vietnam War. Bill's journey then comes full circle as he travels back to Nazi-occupied France and is swiftly carted off to a death camp, but not before he notices his two friends exiting the bar, seeing he's disappeared. Time Out is the film's only segment that wasn't a direct remake of a classic episode. However, its strong running themes of prejudice and racism were commonly used in many episodes. One in particular, entitled A Quality of Mercy, had a young Dean Stockwell, later of Quantum Leap fame, playing an aggressive army lieutenant during World War II, who orders his troop to infiltrate a cave full of wounded Japanese soldiers. The attack would accomplish nothing, and many lives would be taken on both sides. But fueled by racist hate, the lieutenant persists. Instantaneously, the tables are turned when he changes into a Japanese soldier and is given orders by his superior to attack a cave full of American soldiers, which of course he's reluctant to do. Now, these two stories have their obvious differences, but they do share the idea of seeing the world through another pair of eyes. Here, the bad guy gets a taste of his own medicine in true Twilight Zone fashion. But I have read some criticisms about this segment saying how ridiculous it was for John Landis to essentially put a KKK hanging in the same realm as something massive like the Holocaust. But personally, I think that's reading way too much into things. Landis is illustrating racism and hate in several different ways and at varying degrees, but still making a point that simple racist thoughts have historically led to bigger and more terrible things. I will say that the segment's biggest flaw has to do with the severity of Bill's punishment. Despite how hate-filled Bill Connor's depicted, that doesn't necessarily mean he's gonna go out and murder a member of another race. So by having him thrust into these racially hate-filled and deadly scenarios seems a bit extreme. Sure, he's an embittered white male who just lost out on a good job and has no qualms with loudly spewing hate-filled comments in public, but that doesn't automatically mean that he's going to leave the bar and go on a killing spree. Of course, racism is terrible and should be wiped off the face of the earth, but it's not like every racist is actually capable of murder. Now, to counter this criticism, it's important to note that Bill's character was originally supposed to live and come out of this nightmare a changed man, but after a tragic real-life incident, certain story alterations had to be made. Bill Connor was played by popular character actor Vic Morrow, who was best known for playing villains and bullies in many TV shows and movies, so he was the perfect fit for a cold-hearted racist like Connor. Allegedly, when Landis initially wrote this story, it pretty much played out like it does in the final edit, but when he presented the script to the Warner Brothers executives, they requested a redemption scene be added in where Bill would win over the audience. Now, in my opinion, I think the story plays out alright since it reflects certain Twilight Zone episodes where the villains usually get their just desserts, and in this case, it seems appropriate in tone. However, to appease the executives, some extra scenes were added, including an action sequence where Bill, still trapped in the Vietnam War, would save two helpless Vietnamese children from a burning village while being fired upon by an American helicopter. Filming didn't begin until the late night hours of July 23, 1982, once Landis' crew was prepped to shoot the ambitious rescue. After Landis yelled "action," Morrow took one kid under each arm and began carrying them across the water as directed. As pyrotechnic explosions were detonated left and right, the helicopter suddenly lost control and spiraled off course. It landed right on Morrow and the two children, killing them instantly. The entire production was soon shrouded in controversy as John Landis and several other crew members were brought up on 3 charges of involuntary manslaughter, but were later acquitted after a grueling 5-year-long investigation and 10-month trial. As ironic and fateful the Twilight Zone tends to be, the tragic death of Vic Morrow and the 2 kids would have been completely avoided had Landis' original script never been altered to include the studio-requested redemption scene, but obviously the unfinished sequence had to be omitted, and the final cut does feel a bit clumsy as a result. That being said, it did end up giving the segment an appropriately bleak and chilling ending for a despicable character who never does get to redeem himself in the finished film. All in all, with the helicopter tragedy in mind, this segment does give me an unintentional case of the willies whenever I watch it, but I still think it ended up retaining the spirit of what Rod Serling did in his more heavy-handed episodes of the original series. The gruesome helicopter incident has plagued the film to this very day, but aside from how it altered Landis' segment, it had an even bigger effect on the film's second segment, which was directed by Steven Spielberg and is considered by most to be the dullest of the 4 entries. In a remake of the Season 3 episode Kick the Can, Scatman Crothers plays Mr. Bloom, a kindly old man who has just taken up residence at a retirement home. Noticing how many of the elders constantly reminisce about their youth, Mr. Bloom invites the group to congregate outside that night and play a game of Kick the Can, where they all magically transform into young children. They soon have a collective change of heart where they would rather be physically old but retain their newly rediscovered youthful spirits. After their rejuvenating experience, Mr. Bloom decides to head to another retirement community to change the lives of another group of elderly residents. And that's about it. Kick the Can is certainly a sentimental piece, and definitely feels like something Steven Spielberg would direct. Yet surprisingly, it's a rather lackluster entry and certainly doesn't live up to Spielberg's standards. It's commonly thought of as the weakest part of the movie, but despite the criticism, there actually are reasons for this. Once Spielberg received the call about the incident involving Vic Morrow and the 2 kids, he was completely distraught, not only about the deaths of course, but also about what this could do to his reputation of loving to work with children, and with the public knowing that a production of his accidentally killed 2 kids, he feared he'd never be trusted with child actors ever again. Initially, Spielberg and screenwriter Richard Matheson had concocted an original segment that involved kids transforming into their Halloween costumes, akin to the classic Twilight Zone episode, The Masks. But due to budgetary concerns, Spielberg decided to instead remake the fan-favorite episode, The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, a parable about prejudice and crippling paranoia, where a mob of panicky suburbanites constantly accuse each other of being aliens in disguise after unexplainable events occur in their neighborhood. Had Spielberg done this segment, it certainly would have made the overall film stronger and more consistent in its suspenseful tone. It would have been a perfect fit for him considering the episode's suburban setting and alien-oriented story are both classic Spielberg ideas, and it would have been interesting to see his take on the episode and its famous twist ending. However, after he got the call about the helicopter incident, his emotional state of mind naturally made him completely apprehensive towards filming at night with child actors and dangerous special effects. At first, Spielberg tried opting out of filming a Twilight Zone segment altogether and even came close to abandoning his co-producing credit completely. Understandably, his heart just wasn't in it anymore, but he was advised by Warner Brothers lawyers to not stir up any false suspicions by suddenly dismissing the entire project, so he reluctantly decided to do Kick the Can, which took under a week to film, and the somewhat uneventful tone of this entry certainly feels like the result of Spielberg's disinterest in the project. Kick the Can feels a bit out of place with the surrounding stories being creepy and suspenseful, but because the TV series had episodes with many differing tones, it didn't feel completely out of character to have a segment that represents the lighter side of the Twilight Zone. Overall, both the segment and the episode it's based on share the same basic premise. Old folks play Kick the Can and turn back into kids, but I think the episode is stronger because it doesn't feel excessively sentimental or whimsical. I was, however, catching a bit of a Cocoon vibe, which I think is a movie that does a much better job at capturing the fountain of youth fantasy. Acting-wise, Scatman Crothers is a sheer joy to watch as he plays the role of magical black man that probably would have been given to Morgan Freeman had this movie been made 20 years later. Almost every line of dialogue between the supporting characters is like a shot of sugary sweet saccharin that tries a little too hard to drum up emotion from the audience. Despite it being sort of boring, Spielberg's segment does look great, and in no way does it turn me off to the point where I have to skip over it whenever I watch the movie. Is it the weakest part? Easily, but that's the kind of risk you take when making a multi-part movie like this, and it's understandable considering the circumstances. Spielberg had seen 2 early directing efforts from low-budget filmmaker Joe Dante, 1978's Piranha and 1981's The Howling, and quickly connected with his outlandish sense of humor, not to mention Piranha being almost a parody of Spielberg's own film, Jaws. Spielberg was in the initial stages of developing the ghoulish horror comedy Gremlins, and much to Dante's surprise, Spielberg felt that he would be the perfect director. So meanwhile, as Gremlins went into early pre-production, Spielberg brought Dante in to direct the 3rd segment of the Twilight Zone movie. It was based on another beloved episode entitled It's a Good Life, where a spoiled little brat named Anthony has the frighteningly powerful mental abilities to wish whatever he pleases, and Anthony's family and the townspeople are completely terrified of his so-called talent, having to constantly walk on eggshells in his presence so that he doesn't decide to wish them into a mysterious cornfield where they would never be heard from again. The movie version departs itself from the episode by featuring Kathleen Quinlan as a schoolteacher named Helen Foley, who has just stopped off for lunch at a diner while she moves herself to a new town. And in this scene, we have a cameo appearance from actor Bill Mumy, who played Anthony in the original episode. Out in the parking lot, Helen accidentally runs into Anthony with her car. Ooh, jeez. Yeah, that wasn't convincing enough. We're gonna have to do a couple more takes. After damaging his bike, Helen drives Anthony home, where we meet his intensely welcoming family, including Patricia Barry and William Shallert as Anthony's mother and father, and Kevin McCarthy as Uncle Walt, all of whom were once guest stars on old episodes of The Twilight Zone. Playing Anthony's sister Ethel is a young Nancy Cartwright, years before she was famously cast as the voice of Bart Simpson, and at times you can almost hear Bart's voice slip out.
Now do you realize you'll never get out of here? You think it was an accident you came here? He made it happen. He brought you here, just like he brought us here, and kept us here. Just the way he'll keep you here.
Why, you little...
In one of the creepiest and most memorable scenes from the movie, we learn that Anthony has a second sister named Sarah, whom Anthony once severely punished by having her mouth erased. Certain deviations are made from the classic episode, most memorably an idea that seemed to come from director Joe Dante himself, Anthony's obsession with cartoons, and instead of wishing things into a mystical cornfield, he wishes them into Cartoon Land, which is Ethel's fate for not being able to tolerate Anthony any longer. This interesting little addition not only reeks of Dante's own love for classic Looney Tunes cartoons, which he employs in his later films, but also seems to comment on how a child's perception of reality can be skewed negatively by watching too much television.
Anything can happen in cartoons.
The original episode's bleak wrap-up shows no end in sight for the prisoners of Anthony's terror, mainly because the episode has no Helen Foley character. In the movie, the addition of Helen acts as our window into the story, and later goes on to make for a happier ending when she decides to become Anthony's mother figure and teacher, so Anthony will start using his powers for good instead of evil. This segment superbly captures director Joe Dante's dark comedic charm and batshit crazy special effects that he injects into his other films. Created by special effects wizard Rob Bottin of The Thing and Total Recall fame, the effects add a uniquely menacing and memorably cartoonish tone to this segment, which is a heavy departure from the more restrained episode. It makes for an insanely fun installment that thankfully succeeds at kicking the film back into high gear after Spielberg's underwhelming segment. Australian filmmaker George Miller had been busy making a name for himself internationally as the director and co-writer of the hit sci-fi action films Mad Max and Mad Max 2: The Road Warrior, both starring a then unknown Mel Gibson. The films were such big hits in Australia that they were picked up by Warner Brothers for US distribution, and while visiting the Hollywood studio to oversee the US distribution of Mad Max 2, director George Miller was invited to have a sit-down meeting with Steven Spielberg about The Twilight Zone. Before he knew it, Miller's next directing job quickly became the closing segment of the movie, a strong retelling of the Season 5 episode Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, which originally featured a pre-Star Trek William Shatner as a nervous passenger of a commercial airliner. His history of nervous breakdowns explains why no one will believe him when he claims to see a gremlin perched on the wing of the plane trying to rip it apart. Of course, everyone thinks he's clinically insane, and as he's carted off to the loony bin, we pan up to see the damage inflicted upon the wing was indeed real. In the film, John Lithgow magnificently takes over the role of the nervous passenger whose intense fear of flying already has him on edge when the story starts, with the plane caught in a severe thunderstorm. Lithgow begins to see a creature doing damage to the wing, which triggers a downward spiral of his own sanity, and this segment does an amazing job at adapting the classic idea in a much more terrifying and frantic manner. As Lithgow's character descends into madness, the chaos on the plane escalates, all the while we know something evil is happening outside. It's a much more intense and visceral experience than watching the original episode, which comes off a bit more comical in comparison.
So, how was your trip, sir?
Horrifying at first. I looked out the window, and
I saw something on the wing of the plane. The same thing happened to me.
Then there's the Gremlin, which is given a much welcome facelift in the movie. As much as the original episode is a classic, I could never really get behind the look of the Gremlin, and I think it's because the sight of it takes me back to the scene from Batman and Robin with Poison Ivy's stupid pink gorilla disguise. Yeah, try and unsee that now.
Curses!
But the Gremlin in the movie is much more terrifying with its leaner build, milky white bug eyes, those weird predator-like dreadlocks, and of course, that big slimy hand. However, there is this one shot in the film that has always made me do a double take. When John Lithgow opens the window shade and comes face to face with the creature in a genuinely surprising moment, we then cut back to his reaction. Did you see it? What in the bloody hell is going on there? It only lasts for half a second, but it's so bizarre and comes very much out of nowhere. It's one of those strange little touches that I've never quite been able to put my finger on, but that's why I think it's so awesome, and it just adds that little extra jolt to the madness. Again, this story ends with the damage to the wing being very real, even though Lithgow is hauled off to the insane asylum, but the movie doesn't quite end there, as we get a brief visit from a familiar face.
So you had a big scare up there, huh?
Oh, yeah.
Want to see something really scary?
Okay, well, all that stuff I said about the prologue not feeling enough like the Twilight Zone, just forget all that, because that callback makes for a great ending. After a rough and highly controversial production, Twilight Zone the movie was released amongst more scandal than excitement during the summer of 1983. The much publicized helicopter tragedy seemed to leave a bad taste in everyone's mouths, which resulted in the film receiving an overall lukewarm reaction, both critically and commercially. Now this movie is a unique one for me to review, seeing as it's a lot easier to analyze it in separate parts than as a whole film, which is a testament to how spotty it can be. Each story has its own merits, but there's nothing that really ties them all together successfully. Apparently the initial plan was to structure the film where characters would crisscross between the separate stories, creating a more unified movie, but the idea was abandoned sometime during early development. I'd say that if you want an anthology horror movie from around this time that's stronger overall, then I would highly recommend George A. Romero's Creepshow, which plays as a grisly and fun tribute to the old EC horror comics of the 1950s. Even though Twilight Zone the movie is supposed to be a loving tribute to the TV series, it doesn't quite capture the same feel. And who knows, maybe the helicopter crash and the falling out between producers John Landis and Steven Spielberg had a hand in that. But please, don't think that I'm trying to trivialize such a tragic event by saying how much it affected the outcome of a stinking movie, because, to repeat what was said around the time of its release, no movie is worth dying for. Now, despite its flaws, the movie does have some extremely high points, like strong acting across the board, impressive 80s era special effects, and an awesome musical score composed by Jerry Goldsmith, who had scored several Twilight Zone episodes earlier in his career. Goldsmith does a stellar job at not only faithfully adapting Marius Constant's iconic TV theme, but also managing to write strikingly different music for all four stories. His score for Time Out is a ghoulish and pulsating composition layered with hard smacks to the piano keys and haunting taps of military war drums. Kick the Can's adventurous score attempts to capture that signature Spielberg sentimentality and whimsy, and even though it gets a bit overbearing and schmaltzy for a rather low-key story, I still can't help but like it. Goldsmith's wickedly cartoonish score for It's a Good Life can be ominous one minute and completely off the wall the next. Its menacing Looney Tunes flavor indeed foreshadows the score he would go on to compose for director Joe Dante's next film, Gremlins. And finally, Goldsmith's most horrific and suspenseful score can be found in Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, and with its devilish, fast-paced strings and bombastic brass section, it's a piece that feels like something that might have inspired the dark and gothic stylings of Danny Elfman, who didn't become a mainstream film composer until a few years later. Overall, Twilight Zone the movie is just pure 80s fun that has been sadly overshadowed by a deeply tragic accident, and the fact that it had to happen during the filming of a Twilight Zone movie of all things only makes the situation that much more chilling. Over the years, I think Twilight Zone the movie has been looked at by many as sort of a missed opportunity that never does quite achieve greatness, and I think that's probably why its popularity has remained at a cult level. It's a shame too, since the film was originally conceived to be a loving homage to a great TV series. But I still say check it out because the good moments highly outweigh the bad. And if nothing else, segments 3 and 4 are quite possibly two of the most unique examples of mainstream studio filmmaking from this time period, considering the directors got very little interference from the executives, who essentially wrote the film off after the helicopter incident. Outside of quality, Twilight Zone the movie is just one of those films I find to be highly rewatchable. To this day, I'll still pop in this piece of nostalgia once or twice a year to revisit that wondrous land whose boundaries are that of imagination, and I don't plan on breaking that tradition anytime soon. Unfortunately, both the Blu-ray and DVD only include the theatrical trailer as a special feature. But, in all honesty, this is one of those movies where I'm not surprised to see a lack in behind-the-scenes bonus content. Either way, the remastered picture quality on the Blu-ray is pretty great, and the audio is a good test for your Dolby Digital 5.1 surround sound. Twilight Zone the movie is an entertaining journey that can be a bit uneven at times, but it still has a little something for everyone. But unfortunately, the Blu-ray doesn't really offer any extra incentives for me to give the whole package any more than a 3 out of 5 discs recommendation. This is a fun flick.
I loved it.
Over the years, the legacy of the Twilight Zone has only grown stronger, with its ideas continuing to influence movies and TV shows to this very day. And even if certain concepts weren't directly inspired by the Twilight Zone, they were still predated by this innovative series. The Twilight Zone has not only become an indelible piece of pop culture history, but also an extension of our lives if you think about it. I mean, who hasn't found themselves humming the Twilight Zone theme in their head whenever something weird or unexplainable happens? Rod Serling's concept of a mysterious, unseen realm that anybody can lose themselves in is such a genius idea that it has gone on to capture the imaginations of millions, which probably explains why it's inevitable that so many stories in various mediums have been compared to, or inspired by, the Twilight Zone. Even though it underperformed at the box office, the 1983 feature film easily made back its modest budget, so CBS went ahead and greenlit a 3-season television revival that began in 1985. A third Twilight Zone series was produced in 2002 and was hosted by actor Forrest Whitaker, but it only lasted for 1 season. A few relatively newer but completely unrelated Twilight Zone projects have been floating around the rumor mills for several years now, including a Rod Serling biopic, a new Twilight Zone feature film produced by Leonardo DiCaprio, and another revival of the TV series produced by X-Men director Bryan Singer. The highly influential reach of the series has even crossed over into the vast world of parody, predominantly through popular comedy shows like Futurama and The Simpsons. In fact, the long-running annual Simpsons Halloween specials have paid tribute to Rod Serling's creations on many occasions, with installments that include a classic spoof of It's a Good Life that features Bart having godlike control over Springfield citizens, or the famous takeoff of Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, where Bart is terrorized by a gremlin on the side of his school bus. And it would seem the gremlin's design here is modeled after the movie version specifically. If you went back through many of the classic Simpsons Treehouse of Horror episodes, you'll be surprised at how many times the Twilight Zone has been lampooned by America's favorite yellow-skinned family.
Cool, man.
Beyond the realm of TV and movies, the Twilight Zone has gone on to inspire comic books, magazines, games, dramatic radio adaptations, and even a long-running attraction at many Walt Disney theme parks worldwide. Well, I suppose that'll about wrap things up for this episode of the DVD Shelf Movie Reviews. Thanks for joining me today on this journey through the extensive universe of The Twilight Zone, and make sure to check out more episodes of the DVD Shelf Movie Reviews at happydragonpictures.com. So, I'll see you next time, but for now, this one's going back on the DVD Shelf.
Obsession, consumption, excess, addiction. Ugly words, depending on your interpretation. But what do these words have in common? Consumption in excess can elevate an obsession into an addiction. Case in point, David Rose had to learn the hard way that his obsession with film has led to an addictive consumption of Blu-rays and DVDs. One might call it a harmless collection, but there comes a time when a modest accumulation can get so excessive that what resides within the collection is no longer of consequence. All that's left is a constant feeling of need, which will in time lead to emptiness. This, my friends, is where we become the consumed. File this lesson under C for covet and place it neatly on a shelf that stands in the deepest, darkest corner of the Twilight Zone.
In his own twisted and distorted lexicon, he calls it faith, strength, truth. But in just a moment, Peter Vollmer will apply his...